But here's the big idea. In a startup, there is no known process. You're running experiments, you're trying this over here, you're trying this over here, and if you're doing a startup right, those failures are not big explosions. They're small little iterations. They're small little tests. And while they look like failures, they're kind of like, oh, well, that didn't work. We were testing kind of an experiment. That experiment didn't work. Okay, we have enough money or time. Let's go do something else. Now, sometimes you run out of time and money, and the failure is complete in a startup. You've got to lay everybody off, and that's not a good feeling. But the types of failures in a large company, if you were an employee with a job spec and a title and a business card, it's very different than a failure in a startup. Does that make sense?
But if you're in a company, there's this massive, massive safety net.
Yes.
It's a massive safety net.
Until it goes out of business.
Your ability to screw up is infinitely smaller in a big company unless you're just an idiot.
See me.
Well, except that's, listen, we'll get to that in a second because part of this whole thing is entrepreneurial versus in a large company versus innovator.
Yeah.
Let's just jump around a little bit, if you don't mind. One of the things that I've read just in the last couple of days that you were writing about, and it's stuff you've written about for 2 years now. Think about Apple as a company. Think about Microsoft as a company. These are these massive, oh my God, if I bought stock in Apple and da-da-da-da-da. They couldn't make any more money than they made. Both are on a road to ruin because...
Well, one of them is on the road to ruin.
Yeah.
The other is on the road to resurrection, actually. You know, Apple, how many of you have iPhones? How many of you want, and the rest of you how many of you want an iPhone, right? It turns out that Apple, within the span of like 6 years under Steve Jobs, invented 3 industries, right? The basically digital music business with the iPod, then the iPhone, then, you know, the whole Apple App Store, all radically changed consumer retail for computer business, radically changed Apple within the span of less than a decade. But when he died, innovation died with Apple. And with all due respect to Tim Cook, who's made more money for that company than Steve Jobs ever did. So let's separate out, is Apple the most profitable company on the planet? Absolutely. And if you measure success for the CEO, that is the guy in charge of the company, of how much revenue and profit you make, there's never been a better CEO on the history of the planet. But if you measure the success of a company on how they change the world, Tim Cook is the guy in charge of supply chain, meaning manufacturing.
What's your next act?
Right. There is no next act under the current management at Apple.
Right.
And if you look at what happened to Microsoft, for those of you who know, maybe your grandparents could tell you about this company called Microsoft. They used to be Facebook, Google, and Apple all rolled into one, believe it or not. Just imagine that. In computing, they were it. And there was a guy named Bill Gates who ran the company for about 20 years, and when he retired, the equivalent of Tim Cook took over from him, a guy named Steve Ballmer, who grew Microsoft, incredible revenues, incredible profits. Oh, and by the way, he missed mobile. Oh, he missed search. He missed phones. He missed almost every other trend in the 21st century, but it was an incredibly profitable company, but stopped innovating, period. And the resurrection part is 2 years ago, they got a new CEO, and who's now building more innovative computers than Apple is, which is kind of a rare act. But in fact, the one other example in business you might know of, you might hear of a company called Disney. Yeah. In 1984, Disney was about to be sold off for piece parts for its real estate. Disney, a company that was founded in the 1920s and, you know, was one of the most creative animated movie companies, did Disney World, Disneyland, etc. By 1984, it had forgotten how to be creative. Literally, it was like execution CEOs who were just like figuring out how to move the pieces around. And it was the board finally said, well, we're either going to sell it off for real estate, or we'll hire this guy named Eisner, who brought in a guy named Katzenberg, and they basically did a Steve Jobs to the company. Basically, the Disney we know today, the powerhouse, was truly a resurrection story.
So,
I forgot what your question.
No.
Anybody got a better question? We'll take it from that
All
later.
of this is part of a bigger, more important picture that is worth at least trying to understand. From the standpoint, though, so here's an entrepreneur. You get a CEO at Disney,
yes,
whose mindset is entrepreneurial. Like, we need to build a business. stuff that's different. As he turns out, let's go back to our roots. Let's do animation. That's why he hires Jeffrey Katzenberg. That business just got sold for how many billions, and et cetera, et cetera. Because if you go to work for Macy's, and unless you're and if you have an entrepreneurial mindset, you can innovate
in a large
company.
If in fact senior management believes there's a need to innovate versus execute. And here's a big idea. Here's a difference when you think of jobs. And see if I could get this in a way that because I struggled with understanding it. Large companies, believe it or not, you ready for this, are large. The question to ask is, how did they get large? Truly is an interesting question. Think about that for a second. How did they get large? Well, they figured out what to sell. And they figured out how to sell. And they figured out how to compete. And they figured out what titles are and what jobs people should be doing inside the company. And so what they did to get large is they did more of the same, better. So large companies get large, and here's a word to remember, is they execute, meaning they do the same thing on what's called their business model. You know, how are we selling, how are we pricing, who's our customers, etc. Large companies are at their core execution engines. And if you go to work for a large company, you're going to get a business card with a title. Isn't that exciting? I remember when anybody ever get a business card yet? It's really exciting. And then their name, you know, show it to your mom and your girlfriend and your boyfriend. Oh, look at that! I got a job. And then you go, oh yeah, well, look at that title. But behind that title, here's something you should remember. That title is actually a shortcut to maybe a page or two of a description of a job specification that says what you're supposed to do inside this machine. Your job has already been specified. People will tell you what to do. Oh, what am I supposed to do? Is it shelving this stuff, or is it, you know, doing analytics, or is it doing some marketing? In large companies, when you get a job there, your box is pretty well defined. And we'll talk about how creative you can be, but think about, you want to go work for a large company, those of you are entrepreneurs, you're kind of bound by the execution machine. In contrast, a startup isn't executing at all. The mistake that some startups make is thinking they're executing from day one, but you're actually running science experiments from day one. You're searching instead of executing. That's a big idea. Large companies execute things they know. They know who their customers are. As I said, they know pricing, they know competitors. But in a startup, you're kind of guessing, even though you say, oh, I know here's our customers, and those of you are going to give pitches today, here's exactly why we're geniuses, and whatever, you're guessing. And that means you're searching. And some people are actually, most normal people want a job. Most normal people want that 2-page job description that tells you, here's what I'm going to do when I show up at work, and here's what I do from 9 to 5, and then I get to go home, etc. Guess what? In a startup, there is no job description. Or if it is, it changes hourly. And your title is kind of irrelevant. You might have a title, but that's not really what you were doing on Monday, and it changed on Tuesday. And therefore, the level of uncertainty in a new venture is like 1,000x different than most jobs in a large company. Does that make sense? So here's a test. If you're not comfortable in chaos and uncertainty, don't work in a startup. And that includes most normal people. Most normal people are more than happy to go in, have somebody tell them what to do. And I spent 4 years in the military. Yes, sir, I know exactly what to do. You can go fly the airplane some other place. That's where you drop the bomb there, not over there. Okay, we got that. But if you think about it, there is a group of individuals that are actually, and we talked about this last time, have grown up in chaos and uncertainty, and for the first times in your life, you might have an unfair advantage. And for those of you who grew up in a dysfunctional family, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So if your life has been bringing order out of chaos, out of survival, you, for the first time in your life, will have an unfair competitive advantage as an entrepreneur. No joke. So that's how I grew up, where I never knew what was going to happen when I woke up that morning. You know, I never knew who was going to be in the house or whatever. And it was survival mode, but it forced me to focus on survival. And in fact, gave me a set of skills that allowed me, when everybody else was going, how can you focus on all this? like crazy. You go, you don't understand what crazy is. Like, no one's being, like, there are no knives being thrown today. It's a pretty good day. For those, I won't ask you to raise your hand, but I used to do this survey for my students, and it turned out that a disproportionate of startup CEOs in Silicon Valley came from some kind of family background or some immigrant background that had, oh yes, I swung across the river with my clothes in my feet to escape X. And that's pretty good training to start thinking as an entrepreneur. So for those of you for the first time in your life, might realize that I actually have a skill set.
Or even academic failures. How many of these people who have done these amazing things have horrible academic track records?
Steve Jobs, college dropout. Bill Gates, college dropout. Larry Ellison, college dropout. Steve Blank, college dropout.
I'm going to jump around. Help me, just ride with me. You good with this?
Yeah.
Okay. So, how many startups have you done?
8. I was a slow learner.
8 startups. 8 startups, and you're basically more of an educator now than a startup person.
Unfortunately, we'll cop to that now.
Right, but you have a lot of fingers and a lot of pies, so maybe we'll get to that later. But, of the 8, how many home runs, how many strikeout, humiliating, go home, tail between your legs, what an idiot.
Yeah, and which, by the way, we'll talk about because I learned more from those than the success. But I had 4 what are called IPOs, public offerings. The last company was worth $8 billion when I retired.
That's a home run, I guess.
Yeah, nowadays, even today, it would still be counted somewhere. It's kind of interesting. But the next to last one was the most dismal failure of my life. Anyway, there's a magazine, I don't know if it's still around, called Wired magazine.
Yeah.
I don't know if we still kill dead trees and put ink on them anymore. Yeah. But I was on the cover of Wired magazine. And I was on the cover of Wired magazine 90 days before I realized my company was going out of business. And unfortunately, I had raised $35 million for that company, which even today is kind of like interesting money, even for real money. Not, nowadays people raise 10x more, but it was a big deal at the time. And we had embarrassingly got a ton of press. Of all things, it was a video game company. But it was the hottest video game company in Silicon Valley that never made a game. And so the company's going out of business, just about out of business. I call my mother. And my mom is a Russian immigrant. And even after decades in the United States, English wasn't her first language. So if you have parents who are immigrants, they kind of translate in real time. You got to pause, hey, Mom. And of course, the first 5 minutes of any call was, how come you don't call? So we went through, I now do that with my kids, okay, obligatory, call, if it's busy, okay, great. We should just kind of have a short handle, a bitly, like things like that. So anyway, why are you calling? Well, I just thought I'd let you know I lost $35 million. Pause, translate, and she logically said, where'd you put it? No, it's gone. I spent it. Longer pause. And then she said, oh my God, the country we came from is no longer there. There's no place for us to go. And then she said, and she thought a little more and said, our name's blank. We can't even change it. And I said, no, Mom, the reason I'm calling you is that people gave me the $35 million, and it's really true, just gave me another $12 million to do my next company. And I thought I heard the phone fall. And she said, in multiple languages, they always said the streets were paved with gold in the United States and never believed it until now.
Until then.
And I tell you this story because it's not a Steve Blank story. It's a story about failure and redemption, and more importantly, a story about entrepreneurial clusters. Is you could have a public, humiliating failure, and trust me, it was public. It was like a big crater. It's a crater so deep they'll be finding iridium layers, meaning it was very deep. It was like a big crater. And still, the people who lost the money had enough confidence because it was an honest failure. I mean, they made the same mistakes with me. They were on my board. Yes, let's go do X and Y. And oops, no, it didn't work. It didn't work big time. And why it makes it such a great story is one is Steve Blank's story, but the failure and redemption part is I returned $1 billion each to the 2 investors who gave me the money, who still return my calls. Actually, one of them doesn't anymore, but the other does. But that is the nature of entrepreneurship, and that is the nature of failure and redemption, big time, in Silicon Valley. Is you can make those small mistakes, and you can make big mistakes as long as they're honest.
So you have these amazing young people here who have done apps, they've got ideas, they've got this stuff, and they're thinking, maybe I'm what you're talking about, right?
The failure or the redemption?
Well, the entrepreneur.
Yep.
But here's the thing. How will they learn if the dream of their life is actually scalable? That's not on the list. I sent Steve a list of questions.
Funny you ask. So, have any of you heard of this process called the LeanStartup? Okay. So, myself, Eric Ries, and someone named Alexander Osterwalder invented the process. And the process is pretty simple. Now, just 2 minutes of history. It turned out if you were an entrepreneur when I was an entrepreneur in the 20th century, believe it or not, what investors implicitly would tell you, they never said these exact words, but it's what they meant. They would say, startups are nothing more than smaller versions of large companies. Everything a large company does, I want you to do. So in the 20th century, for all you who are building a company, they'd say, go write a business plan. Go write me the 5-year forecast. And then go hire all these executives, because I like the plan, now execute it. Meaning, go do it. Execute is one word, just go do it. And by the way, if you fail, it's all your fault. Because it wasn't my fault as the investor, I was the genius who gave you the money. Clearly it was a failure of you as an individual. That's how we did startups in the 20th century. And by trial and error, obviously some succeeded quite well, but the failure rate was pretty horrendous. And so one of the things I observed when I retired was thinking about, why aren't there any tools for founders? In fact, why don't people realize that founders need different tools than people in large companies? No one had ever made that observation before. And so remember the distinction I made? Large companies execute and startups search. It turns out business schools for the last 100 years have been making tools for large companies. Strategy tools and tactical tools and how to manage and how to do HR and how to do all this other stuff. But there were very few tools for founders other than use the stuff the big companies were doing. And so the Lean Startup methodology, which John Blago actually here and the ICOR folks teach for the National Science Foundation now, is a very simple process. And here it is. I'm going to give you like 25 years of advice in 30 seconds. Is that everything you know on day one is just a guess. And even though you're passionate about that guess, and even though you want to go do it, we now have enough data to say that while 100% of you think you're visionaries, the data says about 95% of you are actually hallucinating.
Would you repeat that? That's one of those things that everybody should write down.
And you won't know the difference. So the second part is, if you think of everything as a guess, and by the way, when I teach it at Stanford, because they pay a lot of money for the school, I use the word hypothesis. But outside Stanford, the word hypothesis is you're just effing guessing. And so we use kind of a template called the business model canvas by this guy named Osterwalder to write down all our guesses that make up a business. Who's the customer? What are you building for the customer? How are you going to get it to them? It's called the distribution channel. How are you going to create demand, that is, get them into your sales channel? You know, how are you going to make money? What do you need to do in activities and resources and partners, and how much is it going to cost? But here's the big idea. Glad you know you're guessing. Here's the second big idea. There are no facts inside your building, so get the heck outside. That is, arguing with each other for more than 30 seconds on who's right means you don't quite understand yet how to do a startup. Gee, I want this feature. No, it ought to be blue. Now, who cares? You're not the ones buying it. Why don't you ask the people who are potentially your customers? And typically the mistake is not even asking them whether they share your view of what the problem is you're solving. Before you start like telling them, you know, would you like to buy this? You implicitly have a mindset of, oh, here's the problem that I want to solve. And if I just build this, people will, the biggest problem I'm going to have is the office big enough for the bags of money that are going to come in. It almost never works like that. Does that answer the question?
Yes, it does. And the first thing that I was going to start with, just because I'm sort of just so fluid, I have so many Steve blank ideas in my brain.
That's what I do now because I've forgotten all of them.
It's a good thing you wrote them all down.
I want you to know that the blog he pointed you to, I wrote to start. I started writing a blog when my kids were graduating high school, and I thought I'd really tell them what their father did. A, they've never read my blog. But 250,000 people a month now read it. But the second part, I have to tell you a funny story because my daughter now works in New York in her second startup. But when she was leaving college just a couple of years ago, she came home and she was a political science and economics major. And we said, well, Sarah, what do you want to do? You know, political science, economic nonprofit, something else. She said, well, all my friends are going to New York. And we kind of figured she'd end up here. We said, okay, you know, you're in your 20s, New York, pretty cool. Okay, what do you want to do? She said, well, do you guys know anything about marketing? I said, Sarah, what do you mean, do we know anything about marketing? Your mother was the second evangelist at Apple. She went to Stanford Business School. Oh, yeah, Mom, I guess you do. And my wife, Allison, turns to her and says, what do you think your father does? And Sarah started, she was nice, she said, but I was just, she said, well, Dad, you're teaching the engineering school at Stanford. Now I ask you that, but how many of you actually know what your parents really do? You might want to like really go, for the rest of you not raising your hand, go check in, because you don't want to be the subject of this embarrassing story I tell about my daughter all the time. Sorry. To this point.
Yeah. So here's LeanStartup. So there is a template-ish sort of, or at least
it's a bounding box.
Right.
Right.
You can put it up on. You can print it out.
Yeah.
Stick it up on the wall.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's no real orthodoxy,
No.
is there?
No.
There's no real pedagogy. This is not like a what?
Well, so
I hate to say that in a room full of educators.
No. I want to tell you, I knew I was an educator when I could actually spell pedagogy and understood what the word was. But so there's no religion about it. It's a set of rules that actually take an infinite set of choices and allow you as an entrepreneur to kind of bound those choices. What's happened in the last 6 years, for sure, is when the U.S. government adopted my class and made it the standard for commercialization of all science in the United States, it has become, by accident, a kind of adopted framework for doing new ventures. And again, John and the National Science Foundation instructors here, who you should all talk to if you're interested, now teach this to the best scientists in the United States, this same process we're talking about. And I find it a little amusing, because you know, by now I had hoped someone else would have said, no, here's the better model, right? It's not, so even for me, this is not the model for entrepreneurship. Unfortunately, it seems to be still the most efficient model for reducing risk and going out of business. And by the way, following the model, conversely though, won't guarantee success, but I will tell you, it will guarantee that you will do less of the wrong stuff. It's a big idea. If you follow this lean method, you will do less of the wrong stuff and get more shots at the goal with the same amount of cash. Doesn't guarantee you're going to become Facebook or Google or even stay in business, but you will at least, when you wake up in the morning, know, what are we supposed to be doing other than thinking we're building a product and selling something, which is exactly, the selling part is not what you should be doing on day one. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, well, no, you keep asking me that. No, I just keep asking more.
I know.
Right?
I'm being polite.
Yeah. Oh. That was a slap back. I'm just an old reporter and storyteller. I'm not a smart guy. So let's go back to so we have these entrepreneurs. Here's the serial entrepreneur. But what if I know myself well enough to know that I don't have whatever engine needs to be?
So here's the bad news about, anybody read entrepreneurial websites at all? Anybody read any of this stuff? You're screwed. And you're screwed in a nice way, because now all of a sudden, you might think that that's what you're supposed to be doing. I think we've lost sight of something that was actually quite useful, which is this notion of apprenticeship. That is, gee, I'm 22 years old, look at Zuckerberg, he did this, and when he was a college student, therefore, if you're an entrepreneur, you need to start a company or else you're not any good. And I just think that's probably the wrong path for most entrepreneurs. I apprenticed for at least 10, maybe you could even call it 15 years, working for other CEOs who were actually good at it and just learning like heck. And now I was being half facetious of don't read those entrepreneur websites. Now with all that data, you can actually be much smarter faster, but I still think this notion of, no, you don't have to be a founder, go to work for a company if you're interested in some startup that maybe has raised money and actually, can pay you a salary and whatever, and pay attention and suck them dry in terms of learning what's going on there. Think of it as a formal apprenticeship. The difference between now and when I was an entrepreneur, think about this. There were no websites, hard to imagine. There weren't no books on entrepreneurship. In fact, because we were in Silicon Valley, I could get information, but the way you could get information was you were limited by your coffee bandwidth. That is, you were limited by the number of coffees you could have in a single day. That was the only way. So it wasn't just a bit rate, it was how much caffeine could you take and how many coffees could you have. That was the only way you could learn about how to do this, including apprenticeship. But I would not discount, it's okay, it's actually good to say, this is a little scary, or I don't know what I don't want to do, what I don't know. Why don't I just work for someone else? I kind of want to think I want to be in a startup, and you might discover, this is too chaotic for me. There's no way I want to do this. Or, what do you mean we don't know if we're going to get paid? I'm in New York City, I need a job.
I think about that only in as much as I've watched, I work for NBC News, and I've watched what's happened in my universe of trying to figure out how to match up sort of network news and digital news, right? It's still in chaos. There are a couple of small companies that have done it fairly well, but people marched into our building for years saying, we have the answer, we have the answer, we have the answer. None of whom actually understood either business, right? It's kind of an amazing time to be alive in that there are plenty of people wandering around with banners saying, I have the answer, and the sky is falling, and they don't actually know what they're talking about.
So let's put this in context with entrepreneurship. So, and we mentioned Macy's and Sears. Anybody know about Macy's? I think they're down the line, right? Sears. Why are they going out of business? There's one company that's putting them out of business. Who is it? Amazon. Amazon basically didn't exist 15 years ago. It's doing what's called disrupting or screwing up business model. Again, that's a shorthand word for how do they sell, who are their customers, how they make money. When you hear the word business model, it's all these pieces. Macy's business model was pretty simple. I have stores, people come in the store, right? They touch the goods, they're salespeople, I gotta pay, etc. Amazon got rid of all those costs. There's no physical, right? They have warehouses, but they don't have fancy stores. They don't have salespeople. You're the salesperson. Isn't that amazing? You're selling yourself the stuff. And so Amazon disrupted Macy's because it wasn't a better store. It was a better set of bids. It was a better business model. And I'm pointing this out because it's not just Macy's and Sears. That's a visible thing you could see down the street. Almost every corporation in the 21st century, whether it's news or retail or computers or anything else, is being disrupted at an incredibly fast pace. And so, while normally you would join a company and your job would be the same for 10 or 15 years and you have a ladder and a career path, etc., now companies are struggling how to figure out how to deal with disruption, how to deal with innovation at a pace they've never had to do. Not only NBC, and I just spent last night sitting next to a CEO of a traditional media company who actually has gotten it right and nailed it. And had some insights that just dropped. He could have written the book. So his number one view, because Amazon is going after book companies, right? And so, all right, how does HarperCollins compete? He had an insight that, like, he didn't even understand what an insight. He said, you know what, we thought about it, and our business model has customers, consumers of the books, and it has authors, right? Authors. And he said, it dawned on us, we can never compete with Amazon for the consumers. But they don't know what we know about the authors. And so we turned HarperCollins into the author's place. And we spend $200 million a year buying in auction books, and we have to be continually creative, because he didn't use the word, but think about a book publisher. They're in a hits-based business. That is, they publish 20,000 books a year, but like 1,000 make money. Just like movies. Anybody know how many movies are made in the U.S.? Any idea? About 500. Now, how many make money? 10. By the way, we've been making movies for 100 years. You think we would have figured out which 10 to do? No, that's truly the definition of a hits-based business, right? Where it's fashion, it's taste, it's culture, it's time, it's whatever. And some people are great writers who can produce hits, or great directors like Spielberg and others who kind of have a better track record than others. But in hits-based businesses, why are we talking about this?
It was a digression.
Digression. But if you go to, but big companies are being disrupted all the time, and they now need to be entrepreneurial, much like startups. And so there are opportunities for entrepreneurs inside of large corporations as well.
Yeah, I guess with two things. The idea of the apprenticeship, to me, sounds like a very key thing, especially if I'm not feeling like I've got the kit, or maybe the infrastructure of life.
Right.
Because that's a requirement.
And unfortunately, the whole culture of entrepreneurship today doesn't make you feel like it's okay to be an apprentice. And that's just a mistake. I just think there's both honor and glory in doing so, and allows you to check it out for free, right? Especially if you're getting paid.
Well, and the other part of it is, if you're working for a company that is innovative, right, you can see how it's actually done. And I find in my own business, there's, as you talk about so often, there's very little that can replace actual experience. Right? This very notion of, hey, I've been able to observe this with my own eyes, and I've been able to put it in whatever important servers it needs to go in, so that when I need to call on it, I can press the button and there it is.
In fact, you just made me realize the value, and now let me come up with a theory about why apprenticeship is important. I remember in my 20s, I was apprenticing without ever knowing I was apprenticing with some brilliant entrepreneurs. I mean, crazy but brilliant. And I didn't even understand what the heck they were doing. I mean, I saw it, and it just looked like effing magic. I mean, how did they know this? How did they? And what I realized now at the time, I didn't even have the pattern recognition skills to understand what they were doing. I knew it was magic. But one day I realized, not only do I understand it, but I can do it. And I would suggest that the goal of apprenticeship is to figure out, why are these people doing this stuff, and are they wrong, or is it actually a great idea, and here's why? And to develop what I'll call these pattern recognitions.
You can write that one up, I will be looking for it in the blog. Right. Can you go, if so, I've created this thing, I've got this app, I've been in this class, there's a buzz. It's a little druggy, right?
It's a very drug.
Right. First one's free, they're in college, they made an app, they won a prize, they get to be here, they're like, I want to get, no, is it or is it not?
It is.
It's very addictive.
Well, whether it's addictive or not is a good test of whether it's a calling, right? If it was just gee, this is the worst thing ever, and, I hated my teammates, and not everybody carried their weight. By the way, one of the things you'll discover over time is entrepreneurship is a team sport. Even though you might think you're the smartest person in the room, and blah, 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 and I did all the coding, or gee, I'm a great salesperson, etc., you're mistaken. It's not an individual activity. It requires an entire team. And when we teach classes, we could almost set our watch that at least one out of our 8 teams, if not 2, on average, melt down during the class for interpersonal relationships or whatever, or somebody has something else going on in their life. And in fact, it's great. It's actually great for teams to learn that in a class. Because when you see it in life, it's expensive. No, seriously, it's just like a marriage, right? It's like, gee, that's an expensive mistake. So learning how to, you know,
the old joke is, you know why divorce is so expensive? Because it's worth it.
But truly, part of your learning in doing these projects is also learning how to work with other people and which other people you want to work with and how to be a leader and how to be a team player. So that's another skill set that is also, I'd say, probably not well understood enough and certainly not talked about enough.
See, I'm thinking, okay, so I'm listening to all of this, and there are pitfalls, and there are high highs and low lows, and what if I want to be an innovator, right? And, okay, assume there's someplace I find to go be an apprentice. But if I want to be an innovator, as opposed to being out there without the safety net.
So that's an interesting distinction, and to me, the definition was always kind of fuzzy, and so I'll just make it clear. An entrepreneur is somebody who wants to start something themselves. I want to start a company, and I'm going to go raise the money, hire the team, create the reality distortion field so everybody believes I'm larger than life, etc. An innovator could be anybody. I'm inside a big company, and I have some great ideas. Or I'm inside a startup, and I have some great ideas, but no, I don't want to be the person running this thing. I want to at least get some sleep at night, not worrying about payroll and everything else and facilities. But I am pretty innovative and creative. That's, to me, a distinction. And by the way, you can do that in a large company, as long as the large company has a culture that sustains and promotes innovation. And as I said earlier, large companies, at least the ones that are going to survive, are looking for innovators, right? They're not looking for you to start another company. They're looking for you to be helpful and innovative inside their large corporation. And so if you want to look for a large company, you might want to ask is, do they have an innovation culture that supports creative people, or do they want me to be in part of the execution machine, which is usually what the other 98% of the companies do.
And if you're really, really old, like I am, you remember IBM. IBM they made computers. They made giant computers that went in the basements of municipal buildings. And everybody in the country, every town, everybody bought these computers, and that was their business, except they had massive facilities filled with people who wore Hawaiian shirts and had pocket protectors. They just didn't listen to any of those guys. They kept thinking they were in the computer business. They almost went off the cliff. And then they saved themselves and said, run the service business.
Right.
It's, also, Amazon, having been in some of their, what did they have an odd name for them? Fulfillment centers.
Yes. They're warehouses.
They're warehouses. They're called fulfillment centers. And I remember working on a story on Amazon years ago already, and everybody in the stock market, everybody on the, which gets me to a question, believe it or not, everybody was saying, this is not a job model, I'm not a business model, this is impossible, he's wasting all this money on building these giant fulfillment centers, and on and on and on and on and on. He was getting so much flack from Wall Street, and then he kept going, doing what he was doing. So here's the question, back to the entrepreneurs. How willing must you be to swim against the current?
Sure. And swim against the current is, there'll always be popular trends that people say you ought to be doing. There'll always be common wisdom that people will tell you to go follow. Steve Jobs. Anyone remember Steve Jobs? I need to check it. Like, how old am I? Steve Jobs, there's a great video of this talk, and I'm going to paraphrase and get it wrong. He said, look, most people grow up, look at life, and there were walls that kind of bound, says what you're supposed to do and what job you have and, how you're supposed to think. And, most people stay within the walls and try not to bounce against the walls and, go on with life. But a few people people kind of understand that human beings put up those walls. And you can move them, and you can change them, and you could think different. In fact, that was Steve Jobs' whole coming back to Apple ad, is that, you know, think differently is what entrepreneurs do. And it means, tactically, you have to have a profound belief. That is, if you don't really believe in anything, and I just said that, I just remember this. That was a major career moment for me when I had a CEO do the following to me. I was the VP of marketing at a startup. CEO called me in and said, Steve, I just want to test a couple strategies on you. And he drew something on the whiteboard. He said, do you think you go execute X as VP of marketing? I said, absolutely. Yeah, yes, sir. He said, by the way, I need you to also do, you know, strategy Y. And he drew another strategy. He said, do you think you can do that simultaneously? I said, absolutely. Yes, sir. Okay. He started screaming at me like a Marine drill sergeant. He said, these two strategies are mutually exclusive. You have no profound beliefs. Get out of my company. Now, it was theater. This is why the guy was crazy, but I have never forgotten that moment. because I went home and realized I had no profound beliefs. And that I had no strategic view. I was a tactical executor. And in a startup as a VP of marketing, that was a dangerous position to be in. And I was being called out. And so I actually started to figure out what did I believe in, for better or worse, and realized that if I wanted to have a senior position in a venture, I needed to figure out if I want to stay within the walls, do I want to move the walls, what did I believe and where. And so I'll go back to answer your question. Yeah, if you're an entrepreneur, a good chunk of the time is you're going to be a contrarian. I'll give you another personal example. When I came up with this lean startup movement, the total available market of people who believed in it was me. And then when Eric Ries became the first practitioner of the lean startup movement, the total available market became the two of us. Every venture capitalist I spoke to kind of laughed. And when I tried to speak to the people in the business school at Stanford, they said, in fact, I still remember that conversation with Steve. We consult for, you know, I think it was at General Motors, they have 100,000 people. How hard could 6 people in a garage be? And I went, you know, and what I realized was, you know,